The Zenith Interstellar Academy floated like a jewel against the backdrop of the Cygnus Nebula, its gleaming spires and interconnected modules forming an intricate pattern that mirrored the diversity within. Unlike the infamous Helix 9 facility, which focused purely on combat training, Zenith was renowned for its emphasis on tactical diversity and interspecies cooperation. The Academy served as a nexus for beings from across the galaxy, each bringing unique biological advantages and cultural perspectives. The station itself was a marvel of bioengineering and adaptive technology. Training zones could shift from standard gravity to zero-G in moments. Environmental conditions could simulate everything from methane storms to vacuum, and the neural interfaces throughout the facility could translate complex concepts across species barriers almost instantaneously. This technological superiority made Zenith the premier training ground for interspecies missions, diplomatic corps, and specialized tactical units. Among the hundreds of beings currently training at Zenith, Alara Vance was perhaps the least remarkable, at least at first glance. A civilian technician from Earth, she moved through the corridors with quiet efficiency, her movements careful but lacking the predatory grace of many other trainees. Her assignment to Zenith had come as a surprise even to her. She was a xenolinguistics specialist with a secondary focus on comparative physiology, sent as part of a cultural and technological exchange program. Her official purpose was studying various species' neural and physiological responses to optimize interface design and enhance communication protocols. Alara's appearance contributed to her general invisibility among the Academy's population. Average height for a human, with brown hair typically pulled back in a functional knot, she dressed in a standard Tech Division jumpsuit that hung just slightly too loose on her frame. In the artificial gravity, her movements sometimes betrayed her Earth origins, a slight awkwardness that other species noted and dismissed. Her quarters were minimalist, containing only a few personal items, some technical manuals, a small hologram of Earth's Grand Canyon, and a worn physical notebook, an oddity in the digital age. The one feature that occasionally drew attention was her eyes, pale green with an intensity of focus that made some uncomfortable when she turned her full attention their way. Those who worked with her directly noticed her habit of silent observation, the way her hands moved with surprising precision when manipulating equipment, and her uncanny ability to remember details about physiology and movement patterns across species. Xyler, by contrast, commanded attention wherever he went. A Kthar warrior in his prime, his four muscular arms moved with lethal coordination, the iridescent scales covering his body refracting light in hypnotic patterns. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his reptilian build was optimized for combat. Dense muscle over a flexible skeleton, reinforced with mineral deposits that made his hide almost impervious to standard weaponry. His elongated head housed advanced sensory organs that could detect minute vibrations and thermal variations, while his retractable claws could slice through reinforced alloys with ease. Within the Academy, Xyler was considered prodigy. His species was already known for its combat prowess, but Xyler had elevated their natural advantages through relentless training. He could move faster than most targeting systems could track, scale vertical surfaces without equipment, and strike from seemingly impossible angles. His fighting style was a blur of precision attacks, leveraging his forearms to overwhelm opponents before they could establish any defensive posture. Xyler's social interactions were dominated by the Kthar honor code: respect for strength, contempt for weakness, and unwavering confidence in one's abilities. He had formed alliances with other apex predator species at the Academy, but maintained a barely disguised disdain for what he termed the soft ones, species that relied on technology or numbers rather than natural combat ability. Humans fell firmly into this category in his worldview. The prevailing attitude toward humans at Zenith mirrored Xyler's perspective. Humans were acknowledged for their adaptability and technological innovations, but their physical limitations were seen as insurmountable handicaps in direct combat scenarios. Their slower reflexes, fragile bone structure, limited sensory perception, and lack of natural weapons made them objects of curiosity at best and dismissal at worst. Another soft skin joining the tactical seminars, a Viridian student had commented when Alara first appeared in the physical training area. I suppose they need someone to operate the medical equipment. These attitudes were prevalent not just among trainees, but faculty as well. Combat instructors assigned humans to support roles or pair them exclusively with other limited physiology species. When physical assessments were conducted, humans consistently ranked near the bottom, reinforcing the perception that they were present more for political reasons than practical contributions. Overseeing this complex social and training ecosystem was Supervisor Trock, a silicon-based life form whose translucent crystalline structure pulsed with internal energy patterns that served as both their communication and information processing system. Trock's species valued data above all else, seeing the universe as a series of patterns waiting to be identified and optimized. Emotional considerations were simply another variable in their calculations. Standing slightly taller than an average human, Trock's angular form refracted light in complex patterns that hinted at the internal computational processes constantly running. Their voice, when they chose to use conventional speech rather than direct data transmission, emerged as a precisely modulated tone from a specialized vibration chamber within their crystalline structure. As lead training coordinator for interdisciplinary tactics, Trock approached each species with clinical detachment, cataloging strengths and weaknesses with mathematical precision. Humans represented an interesting anomaly in their data sets, a species that had achieved interstellar capabilities despite significant biological limitations. Trock had initially classified Alara Vance as subject of tertiary value, observational purposes only, but maintained data collection on all Academy participants regardless of their apparent utility. In training sessions, Trock would stand motionless, their internal lights flickering rapidly as they processed information and made micro-adjustments to scenarios. The silicon being had been known to stand in the exact same position for hours, running simulations and analysis, while other instructors handled the physical aspects of training. Their assessments, delivered with dispassionate precision, carried significant weight in determining assignments and advancement opportunities. For the first 3 months of her rotation at Zenith, Alara had maintained a low profile. She attended required physical conditioning sessions, performed acceptably if unremarkably, and focused primarily on her technical duties. She spent significant time in the xenobiology labs, occasionally requesting access to training footage for interface optimization studies. Few noticed how carefully she studied movement patterns, physiological responses under stress, and especially the biomechanics of the Academy's top combat specialists. It was during the 4th month that Supervisor Trock made an announcement that rippled through the Academy's social structure. Attention all 4th quadrant trainees. Trock's precise voice echoed through the communication system. Tomorrow's tactical response seminar will include comparative data collection on stress response patterns and basic combat approaches across divergent biological forms. For optimal data gathering, we will conduct a controlled sparring session between Cadet Zyler and Technician Alara Vance. The message continued with technical details about observation parameters and safety protocols, but few were listening past the initial announcement. The pairing was so incongruous that many assumed there had been an error in the system. A Kthar against a human. A Meridian cadet laughed, mandibles clicking with amusement. Will they at least give her powered armor? Perhaps it's some kind of psychological experiment, suggested another. Testing human response to certain defeat. Word spread quickly, and by evening meal period, the upcoming spar had become the primary topic of conversation throughout the Academy. A small crowd had gathered around Zyler's usual table in the Central Nutrition Hall. Will you use all 4 arms, or limit yourself to just 2? Asked a Saracen fighter, their bioluminescent patterns flashing with humor. Zyler reclined with casual arrogance, his secondary arms casually manipulating a complex puzzle cube while his primary hands gesticulated. Supervisor Trock specified basic combat approaches. I suppose I should demonstrate proper form, even against an inadequate opponent. The betting pool is already active. Mention Dorval, a mammalian strategist with iridescent fur. Current odds have you winning within 30 seconds. Some optimists are giving the human a full minute. 30 seconds. Zyler's scales rippled with amusement. That assumes I would drag it out for demonstration purposes. 10 seconds would be more realistic. The conversation continued, with various scenarios being proposed, all ending with Alara's swift defeat. Nobody bothered to lower their voices when Alara entered the nutrition hall and took a seat at an empty table near the far wall. If she heard the discussions, she gave no indication, focusing instead on her meal and a small datapad beside her tray. In a far corner of the nutrition hall, away from the boisterous discussions, a smaller group was having a different conversation. Mila, a Solarian empath with translucent skin that revealed a network of glowing neural pathways, looked troubled. Someone should speak with Supervisor Trock, she said quietly. The physical disparity is too great. Even with safety protocols, the human could be seriously injured. Trock doesn't make calculation errors, replied Nexus, a quantum-linked entity who manifested as a pair of identical humanoids who always moved in perfect synchronization. There must be some purpose beyond what is apparent. Perhaps it's a lesson in humility for Zyler, suggested Tam, a heavily furred being with multiple eyes arranged in a circle around their head. Though I fear the lesson will come at Technician Vance's expense. Meanwhile, across the academy, informal betting pools had emerged in various quarters. The wagering focused not on whether Zyler would win. That was considered a certainty, but on how quickly and by what method. The longest odds, offered almost as a joke, were on Alara lasting more than 2 minutes or scoring even a single point against the Cthar warrior. Only one bet was placed on Alara winning. It came from an anonymous account and was so small that the system administrators assumed it was a technical error or perhaps a gesture of symbolic support from a fellow human. While speculation ran rampant throughout the academy, Alara's preparation followed a different path than most expected. Instead of last-minute physical conditioning or practice with combat instructors, she spent her evening in her quarters with the lights dimmed, surrounded by holographic projections. The projections showed hundreds of hours of Cthar movement patterns, training sessions, combat demonstrations, and particularly Zyler's previous sparring matches. She had compiled these recordings over months, analyzing them during her off hours. Now she watched specific sequences repeatedly, occasionally freezing frames to make notes in her physical notebook. Her focus wasn't on their impressive speed or strength, but on the underlying biomechanics, weight distribution during different attack patterns, the slight telegraph of muscle movement before a strike, the pivot points of their skeletal structure, and most importantly, the locations of nerve clusters and pressure points that remained consistent across Cthar physiology. She paid particular attention to footage showing Cthar warriors in various gravity conditions, noting how their fighting style adapted, or failed to adapt, to changes in physical forces. Unlike many species at the Academy, Alara had grown up in Earth's relatively high gravity, giving her a different baseline understanding of mass and momentum. Occasionally, she would stand and perform simple movements, not combat forms, but precise, economical gestures focused on balance, leverage, and center of gravity manipulation. Nothing flashy, nothing that would appear threatening to a casual observer. Just careful, deliberate movements repeated until they became fluid. Her final preparation came in the form of reviewing basic physics principles that govern movement in controlled environments like the training arena. She ran several simulations of force vectors and counterforce applications, making subtle adjustments to her planned responses based on the results. When she finally powered down her systems and prepared for sleep, her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. She set her alarm for standard wake-up time, arranged her uniform for the morning, and followed her usual nighttime routine with methodical precision. Across the academy, Zyler wasn't preparing at all. He considered the upcoming Spar nothing more than a formality, perhaps a demonstration for other students or an opportunity for Supervisor Trock to collect comparative data. In his quarters, he spent the evenings socializing with fellow Apex Predator students, exchanging techniques and war stories from their respective homeworlds. I don't understand why Trock would waste training resources on this, he commented to Razak, a feline hunter for the Procyon system. The human has no combat specialization. Her file lists her as a technical specialist. Perhaps that's exactly the point, Razak replied, his vertical pupils narrowing thoughtfully. Most field teams include non-combat personnel. Understanding how they respond under threat might have tactical value. I suppose, Zyler conceded without much interest. I'll try to make it instructive at least. A quick incapacitation would provide minimal data. Just be careful not to damage Zenith's token human, Razak warned with a toothy grin. They're quite particular about their fragile diplomats. Zyler's scales rippled in the Kthar equivalent of laughter. I know how to control my strength. I'll give Supervisor. Track their data without breaking their precious soft skin. The next morning, anticipation had transformed the training arena into a de facto spectator event. Though officially only the assigned training group was scheduled to observe, nearly triple that number had found reasons to be present. Some claimed adjacent training areas, others cited cross-disciplinary observation requirements, and a few didn't bother with excuses at all. The arena itself was a marvel of adaptive technology. For today's session, it had been configured as a circular platform approximately 15 meters in diameter, with a slightly raised center and subtle gradients toward the edges. The surface itself could alter its friction coefficient on command, and hidden gravity projectors could create localized variations in force. Though for basic training sessions like this one, they were typically set to standard. Supervisor Trock arrived precisely on schedule, their crystalline form pulsing with rapid information processing patterns. They positioned themselves at the control station overlooking the arena, connecting directly to the Academy's sensor arrays to ensure complete data collection. Today's comparative analysis session will proceed according to standard protocol, Trock announced, their voice modulated to carry clearly throughout the space. We will observe basic tactical responses and stress adaptation in contrasting biological systems. Our subjects represent significantly divergent evolutionary paths, providing valuable comparative data. Trock proceeded to display a side-by-side analysis of both participants. Zyler's statistics were impressive. Reaction time 3 times faster than human average, tensile strength capable of breaking industrial alloys, natural armor equivalent to light combat plating, enhanced sensory perception, and multiple attack appendages with retractable bone weapons. In contrast, Ilera's display showed thoroughly unremarkable human baselines. Average strength for her size and weight, standard reaction times, no natural armor or weapons, limited sensory range, and only 2 manipulator limbs. The only metrics where she scored above human average were in fine motor control and certain cognitive processing patterns, neither considered relevant in combat scenarios. The purpose of this exercise, Trock continued, is not competitive but observational. We will collect data on response patterns, decision-making under pressure, and biological adaptations to threat scenarios. Safety protocols are in effect. The session will be terminated at the first indication of potential serious injury or upon clear submission signals from either participant. As Trock spoke, Zyler entered the arena. He moved with fluid grace, his 4 arms performing subtle, stretching motions that displayed his impressive musculature to advantage. His scales caught the light, creating intimidating patterns that his species had evolved for territorial displays. He took position at one side of the arena, performing a series of rapid movements that were clearly meant to impress the audience as much as warm up his reflexes. A moment later, Ilera entered from the opposite side. Her entrance could not have been more different. She walked calmly, her movements economical and unassuming. She wore the standard training uniform, a light gray bodysuit designed for mobility rather than protection. She carried nothing, wore no specialized equipment, and displayed no obvious preparation. Her expression remained neutral as she took her position, standing relaxed with hands at her sides. The contrast between the two could not have been more stark, and it prompted a fresh wave of whispered comments among the observers. "This is almost cruel," Mila the empath murmured, her skin pulsing with concern. At least it will be quick, Nexus replied, their dual forms perfectly synchronized in their worried expression. Near the front of the observation area, a group of Cthar and other predator species watched with anticipation. Watch closely, one called to Xyler. 15 seconds is the time to beat. Supervisor Trock raised a crystalline appendage. Participants, acknowledge the parameters of this exercise. Xyler performed a formal Cthar combat salute, striking his primary right arm across his chest. Acknowledged Supervisor. Basic combat demonstration. Safety protocols in effect. Alara simply nodded once. Acknowledged Supervisor. Very well. Trock's form pulsed once with bright light. Begin in 3, 2, 1. A tone sounded, and everything changed. Xyler launched forward with explosive speed, his movement a blur as he executed a classic Cthar enveloping attack. This technique, nearly impossible to defend against, involved all four limbs approaching from different angles simultaneously, designed to overwhelm and immobilize an opponent in seconds. His body twisted in midair, creating the impression that he was attacking from multiple directions at once. It was a textbook-perfect execution of one of the most feared opening moves in Cthar combat doctrine. Against almost any opponent, it would have ended the match instantly. But then something unexpected happened. Second 1-2 rather than attempting to retreat or raise a futile defense. Alara made a subtle shift in her stance, angling her body perhaps 15 degrees and dropping her center of gravity slightly. The movement was so minimal it barely registered as a response, but altered the geometry of Xyler's approach by just enough to affect his targeting. Second 3-4 as Xyler adjusted midair to compensate for the slight change in angle. A correction his species could make instinctively. Alara's hand moved with surprising precision. Her right palm made contact with a specific joint on Xyler's hind leg, applying pressure at exactly the moment his weight was shifting. The touch seemed almost casual, but it hit precisely where the nerve cluster controlling lower limb coordination was located beneath the scales. Second 5-6 the effect was immediate and shocking. Xyler's perfectly coordinated attack suddenly became unbalanced as his hind leg sent conflicting signals to his brain. As momentum carried him forward, Alara executed a perfectly timed pivot, using his own mass against him while her elbow made contact with another nerve cluster at the base of his neck, a spot normally protected by overlapping scales but momentarily exposed during his aerial maneuver. Second 7-8 a visible shudder ran through Xyler's left side as temporary neural disruption spread from the contact point. Before he could compensate with his other limbs, Alara had somehow moved behind him, her left hand pressing precisely against a third pressure point along his spine near the hip junction, exactly where the Cthar nervous system routed multiple command signals to the lower extremities. Second 9-10 Xyler attempted to counter, but his movements had become uncoordinated. His natural combat instincts, to lash out with secondary arms while reorienting, worked against him as Alara had already anticipated the response. She sidestepped with minimal movement and executed a simple joint lock on one of his primary arms, applying leverage rather than strength to immobilize the limb. Second 11 the accumulated neural disruption and unexpected loss of control triggered a primal response in Xyler's brain. His body, suddenly unable to coordinate its natural weapons and feeling vulnerable in a way he had never experienced, produced the distinctive trilling sound that Cthar warriors had evolved as a submission signal, a sound he had never made in combat before. Second 12 the moment the sound emerged, Alara immediately released all pressure points and stepped back. She resumed her neutral stance, hands at her sides, and gave a small, respectful nod to indicate acknowledgement of the submission signal. The arena fell into absolute silence. Even the environmental systems seemed to have paused in shock. Xyler remained on the ground, his four limbs trembling not from injury, but from the residual effects of the targeted neural disruption. His scales had lost their intimidating luster, now reflecting confusion more than anything else. He stared at Alara as if seeing something impossible. Supervisor Trock stood perfectly still, their crystalline structure showing unusual fluctuation patterns that suggested processing overload. The data being collected had diverged so dramatically from predicted parameters that their analytical systems were struggling to recalibrate. The silence stretched for several seconds before being broken by a gasp from somewhere in the observation area, followed by a rising tide of whispers that quickly grew into exclamations of disbelief. What just happened? Did anyone see that? Is this a malfunction in the arena systems? Impossible. The shock rippled through the assembled crowd as the reality sank in. A human technician with no combat specialization had just neutralized one of the Academy's premier warriors in 12 seconds, using nothing but precise knowledge and minimal physical contact. The first to recover was, surprisingly, Xyler himself. With the trembling subsiding, he carefully rose to his feet, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. His pride demanded denial, excuses, accusations, but the warrior code ingrained in him recognized something his ego wanted to reject. He had been defeated fairly and completely. Match concluded. Supervisor Trock finally announced, their voice modulation slightly off pattern. Data collection complete. All participants and observers will remain for debrief. The chaos that followed was unprecedented in Zenith's orderly history. The handful of individuals who had placed even minor bets on Alara were suddenly facing astronomical returns. Academy security had to intervene when accusations of cheating erupted from those who had lost substantial resources on what they had considered a guaranteed outcome. Meanwhile, at the control station, Supervisor Trock and several senior instructors were reviewing the match footage frame by frame, their analysis creating a cascade of new questions and revelations. Note the precision targeting of Cthar neurological vulnerabilities, observed Dr. Lien, the Academy's senior xenobiologist. She hit exactly 3 major nerve clusters that aren't even documented in standard xenobiology texts. The timing is equally significant, added Combat Master Vorik, a veteran instructor. Each contact occurred precisely when momentum and weight distribution made those points maximally vulnerable. This wasn't luck or instinct. Trock's crystalline form pulsed with rapid calculations. The implications are significant. Our assessment protocols may require fundamental recalibration. As the analysis continued at the control station, Alara stood quietly at the edge of the arena, her posture and expression unchanged from before the match. She seemed entirely unaffected by the commotion around her, simply waiting for further instructions as protocol demanded. Xyler approached her with a formality that surprised those watching. His posture had shifted from the aggressive confidence he typically displayed to something more measured. He performed the formal Cthar acknowledgement gesture, a movement typically reserved for respected equals. Your technique was unexpected, he said, each word carefully chosen. I would know how you identified vulnerabilities my own kind believe to be protected. Alara's response was straightforward. I observed. Your training footage contains patterns. All bodies have biomechanical principles. Neural pathways follow predictable routes based on evolutionary development. You studied me, Xyler stated, a new understanding dawning. I studied everyone, Alara corrected mildly. It's my job to understand how different species interact with systems. Bodies are systems, too. Before their conversation could continue, Supervisor Trock approached, their crystalline form still pulsing with unusually complex patterns. Technician Vance, your methodology requires explanation, Trock stated. The outcome diverges from all predicted parameters. I'd be happy to explain, Supervisor, Alara replied, her tone shifting slightly to a more formal register. Would you prefer a general overview or a detailed breakdown of the specific techniques used? Complete data would be optimal, Trock responded. Alara nodded and began a surprisingly thorough explanation. My approach was based on 3 fundamental principles: observation, physics, and targeted disruption. Over the past 3 months, I've analyzed approximately 342 hours of Cthar training footage, with particular focus on movement patterns under varying gravity conditions. She continued with clinical precision, describing how she had identified subtle tells in Cathar attack sequences, mapped the locations of normally protected nerve clusters by studying rare footage of Cathar receiving medical treatment, and calculated the optimal force vectors needed to temporarily disrupt neural commands without causing lasting damage. The key insight, she explained, was recognizing that Cathar combat techniques evolve in their home gravity, which is approximately 1.3 times Earth standard. In Zenith's standardized gravity, there are microsecond timing differences in weight distribution during aerial maneuvers. Those differences create momentary vulnerabilities in otherwise protected neural pathways. As she spoke, the gathering crowd grew. What had begun as a spectacle had transformed into an impromptu masterclass. Combat specialists from various species listened with increasing interest as Alara detailed her methodology with the precision of a scientific presentation. Most significantly, she continued, I observed that apex predator species often develop combat techniques that rely on overwhelming force rather than efficiency. This creates systematic vulnerabilities to minimal force approaches that target specific neural or biomechanical weak points. Zyler, still standing nearby, found himself nodding in reluctant agreement. His species had evolved as the dominant predator on their homeworld, with few natural enemies. Their fighting style emphasized overwhelming force because they had rarely needed subtlety. Your assessment has considerable implications, Supervisor Trock stated when Alara concluded her explanation. It suggests our combat training methodologies may have significant blind spots. Not blind spots, Alara corrected gently. Different priorities. Apex combat forms excel in their intended contexts. They simply haven't been optimized against certain counter approaches. The implications of her demonstration and explanation rippled through the academy over the following days. Training programs were reviewed, assessment methodologies questioned, and new cross-disciplinary seminars established. The concept of evolutionary combat bias became a major topic of discussion among both students and faculty. For Alara personally, the changes were equally significant. The technical specialist who had been largely invisible suddenly found herself the subject of intense interest. Combat instructors requested her input on curriculum revisions. Students from various species sought her observations on their techniques, and Supervisor Trock assigned her to a special advisory role for tactical training evaluation. Perhaps the most surprising development came a week later, when Zyler approached Alara in the nutrition hall. The usual crowd of apex predator species that surrounded him was noticeably absent as he set his tray down across from her. I wish to learn, he stated simply. Alara looked up from her datapad. Learn what? To see as you see, Zyler replied. To identify the patterns I have been blind to. A small smile, perhaps the first many had seen from her, curved Alara's lips. Everyone has patterns they don't recognize in themselves. That's why observation is so valuable. Will you teach me? The question contained none of his former arrogance. I'm not a combat instructor, Alara pointed out. No, Zyler agreed. You're something more useful. You're a pattern recognizer. Alara considered for a moment, then nodded. We can begin with basic observational exercises, identifying movement baselines across different species. As they began discussing the details, others in the nutrition hall observed with interest. The partnership between the human technician and the Cathar warrior symbolized a shift in perspective that was spreading throughout Zenith, and potentially beyond, as news of the 12-second match had already reached other training facilities and military commands. The galaxy had long categorized species by their natural weapons, physical strength, and evolutionary advantages. Now, a quiet human technician had demonstrated that understanding systems, recognizing patterns, and applying precise knowledge could be equally formidable. The hierarchy of power that had seemed so fixed was revealed to be merely one perspective among many possible approaches. In the weeks that followed, a new phrase entered the lexicon at Zenith Interstellar Academy: Vance analysis, referring to the methodical identification of systematic vulnerabilities in seemingly superior systems. Combat training incorporated new elements focused on countering precision-targeted techniques. Apex predator species began studying their own movement patterns with new awareness of potential weaknesses. And Alara Vance, still quiet and methodical in her work, continued her observations. Her small smile now carried a different weight throughout the academy, not one of threat or dominance, but of one who sees the patterns beneath the surface and understands that knowledge, properly applied, can be the greatest equalizer of all.